customary cough at the beginning of the video. Alright, so it is, I don't know why I'm talking about the date. It's January 17th, recording this video. Over the weekend, I DM'd my first game. Set in the SCP universe. It's more modern day, but I'm using 5e to run it, even though that doesn't. 5e is usually used for a much more medieval fantasy, but I'm mainly using 5e for it because I know it pretty well. My players know it pretty well, and the idea of learning a whole new system just to run this product doesn't really interest me. And especially, 5e does the whole hero power fantasy relatively well. The characters are usually pretty strong, and that's kind of what I want to go for. It's, even though the SCP universe is normally much more horror centric, I want the players to feel powerful, but I can also throw absolutely monstrous things at them. And I'm relatively confident that I can keep monsters and enemies a threat, even with players being extremely powerful, without just resorting to, okay, it's got like 9,000 hit points, so it's going to take 18 turns to fucking kill this thing. So I'm pretty confident I can do that. It's seemed to work well so far. And also, as an aside, this is essentially, I'm doing my own aftercare for myself, talking about my own session, because in everything that I am a player in, I tend to record little, I call them aftercares, just little videos talking about the session, going over what worked well, what may not have worked well, things that were fun, things of that nature. And I usually send them private videos, and I send them to the DM. But this one's, because it's to myself, it's not going to be a private video, it's just a full public normal video. But I am just going to be talking about some of the things about this session, some things I think I did well, some things I may have dropped the ball on a little bit. So first and foremost, most of the design, all the characters are level 6 starting off. I've given them all a choice of like some varying guns, whipped up some modern day firearms, and this is an important point. Every character has access to a reasonably powerful ranged weapon, and most of the encounter design takes that into account. Enemies may start off relatively far away, but there's a lot of them. A lot of enemies will more or less have resistance to like normal, quote, ranged attacks in a lot of cases. That's going to be a big feature going forward. Kind of messing around with like an ammo management. It's not really a system, it's just they'll have a relatively large supply of like normal ammunition, and then they'll have a smaller supply of like specialty ammunition, that depending on the mission that they're on. So in the case of the current mission where they're in on London, they have armor-piercing rounds, and everybody's got like a clip of armor-piercing rounds. Now, in the normal Foundation space, the characters in MTS would usually be a lot less proficient and a little weaker, but they would also have more than enough armor-piercing rounds to do whatever it is they need to do, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. And then I've also given each player some sort of customized melee weapon. Because, one, I like melee weapons, so I want to see them used by everybody. But, yeah, everybody has some sort of mostly like customized melee weapon. Like my one player's character, Richter Laszlo, who is a member of the Serpent's Hand, holder of library card, all that good stuff. He has a rapier called the Serpent's Bookmark, and this rapier can generate small temporary portals when it's being used. So it can do things like you can attack a single target through a portal and either attack them like at range, or you can attack them at like a weird angle. Like you go to thrust at their head, but the rapier goes through a portal and it comes out at like, you know, behind them to the side. So you get advantage on that roll, and that works well because he's a rogue, so he gets sneak attack for free, essentially, with using a charge from this one. It's relatively simple enough, but it's effective. I think that one's a pretty solid one. Then another player has a stun baton. This character is like a normal Foundation soldier, and it's just a mace that does a little extra lightning damage. So the total damage is brought up to like a normal, like a martial weapon level. Like comes up to a D10. It's a one-handed weapon. It comes up to a D6 plus a D4. But that also works if he ever rolls 4 or more on lightning damage, which essentially, I think, yeah, if you roll like a total, or you deal a total of 4 or more lightning damage, then that target essentially gets has to make a con save or get stunned from it. And this works well with the homebrewed weakness mechanic I'm using, where instead of like for a vulnerability, instead of like just doubling the damage of that type, which in this case it would just double that D4 of lightning damage, which is really weak and boring. Instead, it's on the complicated side. You get to roll a number of dice that is contextually dependent. Oh! Contextually dependent. You're trying to cut me off. Contextually dependent on the monster, or the target, and the player's overall level. So, like in the case of the normal enemies they're fighting now, they have a weakness to lightning damage. The weakness is a D6, and when you hit a target with any lightning damage at all, you get to roll an extra D6 equal to your proficiency bonus. Not the monster's, yours, because you're the one doing the damage. You get to roll an extra set of dice equal to your proficiency bonus. So when that character attacks with that mace, they do that D4 lightning damage, and then because it's weak, that creature takes an extra 3d6 lightning damage that the player then gets to roll. It feels really impactful, and it's a cool moment. And that's what I generally want to create. And also, it prevents it lets like minor amounts of, like in this case, lightning damage be impactful. And it also prevents large amounts of lightning damage from completely obliterating things. Like, yeah, you get to, with this melee strike, you get to do an extra, 10.5 average lightning damage? That's a really solid chunk of damage. And it's right around double what you're doing overall with this mace on a hit. But if somebody hits a lightning vulnerable creature with like a lightning bolt, they're not doing a total of 60 damage, because the average 30-ish from the lightning bolt isn't just getting doubled and just obliterating everything. They just take an extra decent. So that's still like a good chunk to everything that's lightning, that's like vulnerable. I think that system should work out pretty well. And it also, because it's not so overbearing, and it doesn't just like kill monsters that are weak, that are vulnerable to a damage type, it's much more easily applicable. such that, like, if I were to use a standard werewolf with this system in, like, a normal D&D setting, instead of making it that they're just immune to non-silver weapons, I'd probably make it that, like, they have regeneration, they are resistant to non-magic and non-silver weapons, but if you hit them with a silvered weapon, you do an extra D6. You do this, they're vulnerable to silver damage. And you do this extra D6 on every strike, blah, blah, blah. So, since the session, I've been doing a little bit of tweaking on everybody's ranged weapons, making sure everybody has ammo supplies correctly. I'll be making sure to have everybody track those a little more cleanly. Not that they aren't tracking it already, but just make sure that they are. So I think first off, the main thing I was like really concerned about for myself was running different NPCs, because as a player, I sort of have trouble getting into my character like within one session. I need to play them like in a session or two, and then I can really start to get a handle on that character. Unless I do like a lot of kind of mulling over beforehand or something, but like I need a little time to get into those characters. But to my surprise, it wasn't really that hard. I guess because a lot of NPCs, it's not that they're like throwaway, but they're not like super complicated for the most part. And if they're going to become complicated, that happens later, and you can figure it out later. You go like, okay, they keep seeing this NPC, so I'm going to do a little more work and actually friggin' what do you call it? And actually develop them over time. So I only really had 3 NPCs that the party met this time. There was the site director, which is going to be a recurring NPC. He's a little shorter, old military guy, military type. Pretty stern, doesn't waste time. Well, doesn't waste his own time. He had the party waiting around in the briefing room for a half hour, which that was something I just came up with. Like, okay, they gotta, all right, I gotta have some sort of like, I guess vibe, kind of some sort of vibe going on. So they've been waiting for a while. He shows up, he gives them their briefing, tells them a few things, and I was a little tight-lipped on details, and I felt that like instinct to be tight-lipped on details just because of the nature of like redactions and the SCP wiki in general. But this is an SCP, a dedicated mission. Why wouldn't the party have access to detailed documentation? So unless there's a really big need for him to be tight-lipped, like there's very specific clearances, then the party would have access to all information. That was a little mistake on my part. But set up I came up with a reason why this MTF is the one that has to go do this mission, because the normal access to London is completely cut off. So they have to, they're the only MTF that can use the Waze and basically teleport there. So they can do it. So it starts off, they're a little cautious getting into the area. I tell them there's like a little, like, you know, it's this big sprawling Victorian city. And there's a small area that has a lot of more modern, very temporary looking buildings. And they're a little cautious about it. When they don't, I mean, I know, and probably some of the players know, that there's really no reason to be cautious. But they just kind of are cautious. And a lot of players they're going to be cautious whenever they can. So they get up there, they talk to some dude, some soldier guy, which And then he takes them to the outpost director, which probably isn't really the exact correct title. Just the outpost head should probably be the correct title. But not hanging up on that. They talked to him a little bit. His office was very bare bones. He was eating some shitty food. They talked to him a little bit. Couldn't get a whole lot of information out because this particular guy wasn't super familiar with the what do you call it? The person that they're tracking has escaped down here. So I direct them to this other NPC that's been in this outpost for a long time. And they talked to him, and that NPC, Tenenbaum, I came up with completely on the fly. I only really intended for there to be the original site director and the outpost head, and there wasn't really going to be anybody else to talk to. There were going to be other personnel, but they wouldn't have a whole lot to say. Just because, anything they know, the head, the outpost head knows. But I decided that, they've had this outpost here for a while, and some personnel have been here longer than others. And it's been pretty quiet for a long time. Like the Bobbies have kind of stopped their assaults on this outpost. And I decided this one NPC, Tenenbaum, he's been here for a while, and he knows the one guy that they're pursuing was stationed here years ago. So he knows that guy pretty well. So they got to talk to him, and everybody seemed to really like that NPC. I think that's usually a trend that players always like the more off-the-cuff NPCs a bit more. I don't know why, but I don't know why that's a thing, because that's been relatively true in all the games that I've played. Like, we decide, like, we're walking through the city and we decide to stop at, like, a bakery. And the NPCs in there are two of my favorite ones. Just this random Irish couple that are arguing constantly while we eat this new type of pastry called a croissant. So, on-the-fly NPCs are always interesting. And then, in this particular moment, I was going to have, like, a relatively large encounter with a bunch of Bobbies. And a little, like, distanced encounter with the guy that they're pursuing, whose name is Burke. I haven't mentioned him yet. But he's been doing some sneaky shit. And, they're all up on the outpost wall. There's a 40-foot high wall on the side of the place. And they're looking out. And as the players are looking around, one of them catches a little glint on a rooftop. And then a bullet whizzes by his head. He ducks down, and then some explosions detonate, knocking big portions of the wall down, and an encounter starts where they're fighting. I think I threw like 7 Bobbies at them initially. And then, so then they're dealing with all these Bobbies that are pouring in, and these guys are relatively tough. They're kind of designed, the monsters themselves are designed, these guys are designed so that they can survive a round if only one player is attacking them. If one player is attacking one Bobby. These are like Victorian area police Bobbies fighting. They can survive like a single round easily, like relatively easily, if one player is attacking them without resources. If they're doing that, then these guys will survive one round. But if a single player wants to dump certain kinds of resources, they could probably take them out in one round, or if players are ganging up on one individual monster, they could take them out in one round. And I anticipated that this party wasn't going to act super optimally. They weren't going to, like, pin down individual targets and hit them as hard as possible to eliminate as many as quickly as possible. They were going to spread out the damage a little bit. And that's just what they did. They all kind of took their own and had their own individual 1v1s. So a lot of the Bobbies got to survive a bit. And they were relatively brutal. These monsters are doing, they have 2 attacks each. They're doing 2d6 plus like 3 They ended up hitting the players like roughly 70% of the time. They have pack tactics. If they hit a player once, they can attempt to grapple as a bonus action. So they've got some juice, and it took about like 3.5 rounds, I think, for them to clear them all out. And then the second round, they managed to. I asked the second, or at the end of the first round, I asked them all collectively to give me perception checks, because there's these little bird camera guys that are stealthed. They're hidden from the party, and they've got really high stealth ratings, and if you don't notice them and deal with them, they'll summon additional bobbies. And they noticed it, and they could not deal with them effectively enough. One player, they noticed them at the end of that round, and then in the second round, only one player made an attempt to really deal with them, and then it managed to summon 2 bobbies. I gotta change the formula on how many bobbies they summoned, but it summoned some bobbies in, so they had more enemies to deal with. Then that Tenenbaum NPC, I decided, or I think they healed him a little bit, or somebody just gave him I can't remember exactly what it was, but they gave him a little bit of a pep talk, and he managed to stand up and take a single shot at at that bird, at the eye in the sky, take that out, and then take a shot at a bobby and do a little damage. And then he's heavily injured. He just sat back down, and he was out the rest of the fight. So I gave them a little bit of, I threw them a bone there. Both to make the encounter go a little bit quicker, because otherwise they would have to spend another attack to try to get rid of them. And this Tenenbaum was like a high-level fighter. He had 3 attacks. So he managed to take that eye in the sky out, but then he was basically done after that. So he took that out. That freed the party up a little bit, and it also plants the seed that they have to try to look for eyes in the sky and deal with them, because there's going to be more of those going forward. So, you present them with a little information first off, so that they know kind of what to expect going forward. It's the whole, I've seen it described as like the BioShock track tell. Like you go into a space and you see like a normal enemy has been killed by a trap they set off. So that clues you in that there's traps around. Or like, if there's an ambush, their first shot always misses you. And I kind of did both of those things. But the explosions, they took damage from it. They managed to save Tenenbaum from falling off the cliff, or off the wall at the beginning. They cleared everything out. Then they talked to Tenenbaum a little bit. They talked to some NPCs. They helped some people out, particularly the medic, who's a cleric. He did some stuff. And then 2 of the party, they ran into the outpost head's office to snoop around. And I didn't anticipate they were going to do this. I should. I mean, I already knew it was a pretty bare bones office, but I gave them some stuff to find. And they almost got caught, but they managed to get out, and I kind of went a little heavier-handed, kind of tell them, hey, this is not really going to be anything for you to find, so there's really no reason for you to go back in there. I didn't say that. Instead, I had some NPCs, staring down, and, they catch sight of those 2 party members right before they try to run back in and do some more snooping. But it was an opportunity to characterize the outpost head a little bit. I put a picture of his family in there with his presumably ex-wife's head scratched off, and just his 2 children. So there's something there, If they decide to ask about it, maybe they'll find out. Just, you know, that's just fleshing out the NPCs a little bit. Yeah, and then it was set up like that was the end of the session. I think the combat ran a little long, but it's all right. Yeah, I might record another one a little later. There's always someone right when you go to try to change things. But yeah, I might record a little bit more later on, talking about more explicit mechanics. But I'll say this is part 1.